Lawrence Griffin, a beloved postman affectionately called Larry, disappeared from this pub on Christmas Day 1929. Investigators believe he got into a fight and either died there or was taken to the Gardaí station across the street where he passed soon after. Detectives found themselves constantly sidelined by local police and businessmen, which was odd considering that Larry was well loved in this county. What they found suggests a tragic accident, fumbled by the locals, one which out-of-towners immediately assumed the worst of. Griffin was a veteran and served in British India from 1899 to 1907. During World War I he served, but lost several teeth, part of his ear, and was wounded in the arm. He was discharged and moved back to his loving wife and kids in Kilmacthomas, where he continued work as a postman. This building used to be the Kilmacthomas post office, where Griffin began his regular 8-mile bike route south to Stradbally. In recent years, a memorial was erected for the vanished civil service agent right here. On Christmas morning, 1929, he picked up the mail here, went to church, delivered presents to the children of his friends, and went out a bit late for his bike route. He began his day at around noon. Local tradition mandates the postman be offered drinks at every house he visits and food for Christmas, and he had a full meal at least 2 homes. One can only guess how tipsy he was by the time he reached Wayland's pub. His family thought nothing of it when he didn't return that night. Larry was probably just the happy participant of a local tradition and was probably sleeping this off at a friend's house or even in the home of a stranger. People, after all, were much friendlier in those days. The day after Christmas, when Miss Griffin again found her husband wasn't home, didn't raise alarm either. Again, his absence could easily be explained away as a hangover. Holiday tradition pretty well mandated he drink at every house along the road, and he was probably in bed. It's easy to imagine the Griffin family laughing at the situation. But there was a steady flow of workers from Kilmacthomas to Stradbally, and early in the morning some walkers found his bike positioned suspiciously. It was just north of the 5 crossroads in Carrigahilla, pointing north towards Kilmacthomas, although his route wasn't finished and the bike wasn't packed correctly. Immediately, because Larry was so beloved, 100 men showed up, including Gardaí from Stradbally and postmen from the countryside to help search for him. They fanned out and found nothing, and the police said he probably stumbled off the road to relieve himself when he fell into the bog. This was pushed back against hard because every postman agreed that even a drunk worker wouldn't pack his mail the way it had been left. It would have been destroyed by the rain. In 1929, this was the barracks of the local police station. As you can see, it's directly across the town square from the most popular drinking spot, Wayland's Pub. Chief Superintendent Harry O'Mara arrived to Stradbally before New Year to question the small-town cops, and 5 of them reported they saw Larry, but he was acting quite sober. This caused Chief O'Mara a good deal of suspicion because he knew the Irish custom of drinking on Christmas. Even if the pub were closed, the detective figured that Griffin would be inebriated by the time he reached the southernmost point of his route. Casting even more doubt on these claims were the villagers themselves, most of whom agreed that Larry was at least tipsy. Chief O'Mara learned that no mail had been delivered on the route between Wayland's pub and where his bike was found, so it was almost certainly brought there. But the question was, by whom? On January 6th, a priest from a nearby village paid the superintendent a visit and warned him that the local Gardaí were covering up the murder. While the priest offered little information, he said that a 16-year-old boy, John Power, could offer more. The following day, the boy was interviewed, and Power claimed he saw Larry lounging in front of Wayland's pub with 3 men. At least one of these men was a cop, according to young Power, and they were standing around the post office adjacent to the pub at 6:30 p.m. Power then claims that Larry and Officer DeLea left with the bike around the corner of the pub and up the road and didn't return after an hour. The 2 men remaining in front of the post office didn't think much of it, and they returned to their homes. Chief O'Mara interviewed the 2 men, 2 villagers, and DeLea. They all confirmed Power's story, and Officer DeLea had to admit that his earlier story was a lie. He had, in fact, accompanied Larry 50 yards up the road towards Kilmacthomas, but then left him to walk home on his own. Oddly, DeLea reiterated that he was not drunk, and neither was the postman. Chief O'Mara was beginning to notice a pattern. As if worried the detectives wouldn't believe him, DeLea offered that he immediately returned from escorting Larry behind the pub, crossed through the square, past the barracks where he would have been seen by co-workers, and walked to Stradbally Cove with a local girl. The girl confirmed his story, but she was Sissy Whalen, the daughter of the pub's owner. The story seemed very rehearsed. It also contradicted Power and the other men who stood by him in front of the post office next to the bar, all of whom said they didn't see Officer DeLea return. D'Elia simply remarked that he didn't know why, and they must have just missed him walking. Chief O'Mara suspected that there was a conspiracy within the Gardaí, that they had been slipping away for beers all day, and that finding out what became of Larry Griffin would expose the fact that they were drunk on duty on a day that all pubs had been closed. The pub was across from the square from the police headquarters, and naturally this would have made them all look very unprofessional. Throughout January, detectives pieced together the following story with witness statements. Larry Griffin was a bit too drunk for his own good by the time he reached the village, so he called into the apartment of a police officer named Foley to sober up. Instead, more drinks were passed around, and Officer D'Elia joined them. Before long, it was decided that Larry had enough, and the three walked outside to the front of the post office, the ground floor of where Foley lived. A fourth cop then joined them. Some were off duty for Christmas, which explains why John Power and his friends only reported one officer with Larry. Officer Foley and Postman Griffin then walked up to Whalen's pub to see if they would let him sleep the drinks off there, but realized another Gardaí was following them, a higher-ranking sergeant named Cullinane. It seemed like Cullinane was a bit of a killjoy, forcing them to hide and drink in Foley's apartment instead of openly in the pub where several of them already were. The rest of the station was doing its best to avoid him, and when Foley saw the man walking up behind him, he sped around the corner with Larry Griffin just to avoid him. Cullinane was actually checking to see the pub wasn't serving alcohol, and naturally Foley speed-walked away without confronting the sergeant, who naturally would have chewed him out for drinking on duty. So D'Elia left with Larry around the corner, passing Power and his friends who gathered around this alleyway. The trio entered the pub through the back gate, carrying with them a very drunk Larry Griffin. Probably, Cullinane knocked on the front door and got no answer, and confusedly walked back to the nearly empty barracks. Of course, all the Gardaí were silent about this until they were pressed because they didn't want to tell Chief O'Mara they left the barracks that morning to go get drunk with their friends at a flat overlooking the police station. Sure enough, Chief O'Mara checked the patrol entries and found that they'd been altered. This fact he reported to Owen O'Duffy, the chief inspector and would-be clerical fascist leader of a New Ireland. Yes, really. At that time, the Irish police were commanded by a former IRA volunteer from the War of Independence who would then go on to form a Catholic paramilitary. Some of them would actually follow O'Duffy to Spain to kill communists in the early 1930s. You can see why the Gardaí would have been sweating bullets at the prospect of being exposed in a murder mystery. Safe to say, a small-town rural police force feared the storm on the horizon. The star of the trial was Jim Fitzgerald, who entered the pub through the back gate on Christmas with his friend and two other men. For a while they stayed in the back eating food, but they heard singing from inside the pub and sort of just wandered in. They were served drinks by Sissy Whalen, Pat Whalen's daughter, who would later give an alibi to Officer D'Elia. Fitzgerald didn't witness Larry and D'Elia walking around the corner, but got there after they were already inside. While haggling with Pat Whalen over how much it would cost to room Larry for a night, he witnessed the postman drop 3 half-crowns. Ned Morrissey, who Fitzgerald called a bit of a boxer, picked the coins up and smiled mockingly at Larry. A small argument ensued when Larry demanded it back, and when he was jostled, he drunkenly fell towards the door. Jim Fitzgerald claimed that Morrissey purposely tripped him. Larry Griffin split his forehead open and had a quick change, could no longer speak, and seemed to be dying very fast. He bled very little, but his forehead looked like it had been cracked open. Morrissey was worried he'd be found guilty of murder, and Pat thought it would ruin his business. The Gardaí, D'Elia, and another man drinking in the bar by the name of Murphy knew that their careers were over, so Morrissey suggested they hide the body. Also present for this conversation was Thomas Cashin, who lived right here across from the pub, the head teacher of the local national school. 2 cops left with the bike, saying they'd leave it near the crossroads north of town. Cashin, Morrissey, Pat, and one of their friends put Larry's body in the back of the head teacher's car, told the cops and Jim Fitzgerald that they would dump him in a nearby mine shaft, and then drove off. The teacher, Cashin, owned the only car in town. Jim Fitzgerald's testimony was vehemently denied by everybody present. For some reason, the trial became a fight over whether or not the pub was open. It's important to remember that Ireland was struggling to find an identity so early in their independence, and many authorities placed a huge significance on Catholic social posturing. Naturally, a police department drinking on Christmas offended the sensibilities of the new government. It became a huge scandal. The pub's owner, Patrick Whalen, insisted that they were locked up, but at least 2 villagers said they'd had a few pints that night. It seemed like some of Whalen's friends and police were involved, and they were trying to hide the fact from O'Duffy and from the media. Witnesses changed their testimonies often, and eventually the whole case was dismissed because of this. People asking about the case in town are said to be harassed, so I kept quiet around the locals. The Wayland family kept the place afloat with money from libel suits, and Pat died in 1946. It's a tragedy for all parties, really. Larry was beloved and never seen again, and Pat was a celebrated community leader, forever scarred by false accusations, when the reality seems to be an unfortunate accident and a bumbling cover-up. His son, who inherited the pub, died in 1997, and it was taken over by his son, who now runs it, Patrick's grandson. The Wayland family is supposedly very litigious, but they have a reason to be. In the past, people falsely accused Pat Wayland of murdering Larry in cold blood, which is simply untrue. It paints the village of Stradbally as a village which would cover up one man's murder, when in reality it was a bunch of people who were pretty influential, who had a bit of alcohol in their veins, and didn't think rationally, and by the time the investigators arrived, they realized they had to stick by their lie. And for the last near century, this has been the case. The villagers don't talk about it, even though it's a very prominent family legend.